Welcome back, everyone, and thanks so much for being here. If you've been here since 8:30 this morning and you're now hitting this panel, I can tell you it's worth the wait. This panel, I promise you, will be worth it. We have an incredible array of all-stars to talk about data security incidents and national security. So to start it off, who better to be on this panel than the James Bond of incident response and one of the more experienced globe-trotting cyber lawyers there is, David Lashway, global co-chair of the cybersecurity practice at Baker McKenzie, who has managed incident responses all over the world, including in China, North Korea, and Libya. He's another incident response lawyer that is more than the traditional breach coach. He'll lead the data breach litigation, the remediation, the criminal investigations, whatever happens. And if you want to blame your vendors for the data breach, he'll lead you in that litigation too. He was also the lead counsel to the cyber investigation firm working the hack of the 2016 US presidential election. The bottom line, if there is a major data security incident that spans across the planet and it's very complex, David Lashway is going to be in the middle of it, playing his own incident response arbitrage. Welcome, David, and so great to have you back at the forum.
Thank you.
Well, next up, we have Scott Ferber, a partner at King & Spalding and in the firm's data privacy and security practice. What makes Scott perfect for this panel is not just his vast experience counseling C-suite execs and board members during a data security incident, but Scott, I think you win the prize for the heftiest resume of governance experience of anyone from today. You have served a broad range of senior roles at DOJ, most recently as counsel for cyber investigations at the National Security Division at DOJ. And I think you were the second person, was it Nick Odom before you, and that was it? So second person ever to hold that job. He developed and led national security investigations involving these threats across the planet. He's also Associate Deputy Attorney General at DOJ with special emphasis on cyber and national security. DOJ's lead attorney on White House and interagency policy groups addressing incident response, cyber legislation, national security. He was also, of course, an Assistant U.S. Attorney in Atlanta, where he's the office's computer hacking intellectual property coordinator, the CHIP in that office. He's tried numerous jury trials, briefed and argued cases before the Court of Appeals. What an amazing string of public service. Just wonderful, Scott. I look forward to reading your book someday, and thanks so much for being here. And next up is my old friend, Michael Sussmann, a partner at Perkins, Coie, and one of the better-known national security lawyers here in D.C. I go way back with Michael Sussmann. We first met over 20 years ago when I was Internet Enforcement Chief at the SEC, and he was at DOJ as special counsel to the Attorney General and doing really pioneering work on DOJ's manuals on prosecuting computer crimes, searching and seizing computers, obtaining electronic evidence in criminal investigations, prosecuting intellectual property crimes. He would later join the Computer Crime and Intellectual Property section, CCIPS, to combine that national security experience with cyber, and then went on to join Perkins Coie. And what sets Michael apart from everyone here today is that he represented the Democratic National Committee and Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign in their responses to Russian hacking in the 2016 presidential election. I don't know too many lawyers courageous enough to take on that kind of situation where everybody is firing at you at all times. I'm proud to know Michael way back when, and I'm thrilled that he can join us this year to help us teach Masterclass. Welcome, Michael.
John, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to seeing you in person next year.
Yeah, me too. Okay, next up, Allison Bender, counsel at Wilson Sonsini, where her practice focuses on privacy and cybersecurity. What makes Allison so perfect for this panel is I believe she's the only panelist who has an LLM on national security from Georgetown and now also teaches there, offering courses on cybersecurity law and national security regulation. But also, before joining Wilson Sonsini, she spent nearly a decade at DHS, most recently serving as a senior cybersecurity attorney in the Office of the General Counsel. She was the primary operational legal counsel for the federal response to the Heartbleed vulnerability, the USIS Keypoint data breach, and the healthcare.gov data breach. She is just terrific. She's got 3 big rescue dogs, 60 to 85 pounds. So we hope for no Amazon deliveries during this, but please just, we'll just move on. If you hear a lot of barking, she's safe and sound. Those are her dogs. Welcome to you, Allison. And thanks for being here today.
Thanks for that great introduction. And we'll keep an eye out on the dogs barking.
Well, what's also funny is that with respect to our next speaker, you know him probably better than anyone else today because you sat in the office next to him for several years. His name is Eric Goldstein. He serves as the Executive Assistant Director for Cybersecurity for the Department of Homeland's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, as of February 19th. So he has been on the job for exactly about 1 month. And in this role, Eric leads CISA's mission to protect and strengthen federal civilian agencies and the nation's critical infrastructure against cyber threats. I remember when Eric was appointed, I was so thrilled. I knew this administration was taking this stuff seriously. When I saw his name, I was just so pleased. He took the job. I think it's a very challenging job. He used to be the head of cybersecurity policy strategy and regulation at Goldman Sachs. And before that, he held a range of roles at DHS. I had the pleasure of watching Eric testify before Congress a few weeks ago about the SolarWinds attack. And I have to say, he was amazing. He had been on the job less than 1 week. So welcome to Washington. Get to the job, get in front of Congress where everybody just starts screaming at you. Fantastic, Eric. I don't know why you would subject yourself to such a tough situation, but I am sure glad that you did because we are all much safer because of you. So welcome back to the IR Forum. You were here several years ago, and thanks for protecting us. We all really appreciate it. I'm going to turn it over to David now. Have a great time with the panel, David. Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much, John. Really appreciate it. It has been a terrific session throughout the day today. Obviously, recently, Secretary Mayorkas, in his speech on March 31st about cybersecurity-related issues, was highlighting some key elements in the recipe going forward for the Biden administration to address a series of cyber-related, not only recent incidents, but the larger issues associated with cybersecurity and geopolitics. One of the things he highlighted was that we really need to integrate diversity, equity, and inclusion into our model so that we get diverse ideas. And this session today, John, that you and Bruce put together really did that. The panel earlier today on with the women leaders in our space was just fantastic. So congratulations to you, and thank you for having us all this afternoon. We've got a really terrific lineup to talk about national security. Each year in this conference, you all have sought to include a panel on national security related issues and how they overlap with cybersecurity, or in some cases even drive it. Recently in that same speech, Secretary Mayorkas mentioned and focused on the fact in parts of the speech that cybersecurity is a top priority for his administration, the Secretary indicated. We've elevated cybersecurity with the first ever Deputy National Security Advisor, Ann Neuberger, a very dear friend to many of us. The role was filled on the first day that the new president took office, sending a very loud message, not only within the United States, but abroad about the seriousness and national security related priorities that cybersecurity was going to play. Very fortunate to have Eric with us today, as you mentioned, John, and I'm going to turn to Eric to really kick us off. Eric, recognizing you've been there for a month, but you've been in this space for well over a decade, almost two, a great deal of in-depth experience, not only dealing with the weeds, day-to-day cyber espionage, cyber-related crime, but also really importantly, the larger issues associated with geopolitics and the balance and the arbitrage that we conduct when it comes to national security-related issues. Maybe you could give us a little bit of an overview first about how you're seeing things. What's new? What's different? Obviously, we've got a whole new roster of very talented players coming into the government, into this space here in the United States and abroad. And our counterparties abroad, whether they be law enforcement, as we heard on the panel earlier today with our former colleagues from the U.S. Secret Service and FBI, and other areas outside of law enforcement in the intelligence agency. So with that, Eric, I'm going to turn over to you, and then we're going to look to Michael to respond to his view of the lay of the land from the private sector. So thanks, Eric.
Great. Thanks so much, David. And thanks to the forum and their panelists. It's really a privilege to be on this panel, rejoin government, and to work closely with individuals like those in this panel who've worked in government previously and the attendees of the forum. It really is a exciting and I'll call it interesting time to be in cybersecurity. I think it's fair to say that cybersecurity was always going to be a priority of the Biden-Harris administration, recognizing the threat that widespread vulnerabilities and the capabilities of our strategic adversaries pose to our nation's networks. But events of recent months have really been a clarion call for the urgent need to focus on this issue and to focus on it really in two key contexts. The first is as a national security context, and the second is as a issue of business risk management. And I think this panel really brings together those two issues in a critical way. Looking at the intrusion campaigns that we've seen manifest over the past several months, from a national security standpoint, I think there's a few broad lessons that we can take away that help inform how we think through the investments that we need to make in this space going forward. And the first is the sophistication, the maturity, and the resources that our adversaries are able to invest in this space. Looking at what is publicly known about the attack compromising SolarWinds network management platforms, among other threat vectors, in order to access various cloud computing environments, that was a prolonged campaign with highly attuned tradecraft and investment, and reflects that all organizations need to be focusing not just on a single defense, a single control, but really understanding what in their networks an adversary could be targeting, and then focusing on this model of layers of defense and on protecting the accounts, the assets, the data that are most critical to the organization, recognizing that if there's an adversary that is deeply incentivized to compromise a network, they will go to extraordinary lengths to breach the perimeter and try to achieve their objective. And so we need to take that approach of real criticality prioritization to make sure that whatever is most important to a business, to an agency, to an organization, we are focusing first and foremost in ensuring the security and resiliency of those critical assets. Moving to the second major campaign that we've seen in recent months, the widespread intrusions into vulnerabilities in Microsoft Exchange servers, known by Microsoft as the Hafnium campaign. I think there is a subtly different lesson to be learned from this campaign, which is the indiscriminate nature of many exploitation campaigns affecting technology in this environment. And in this campaign, we saw a widespread vulnerability in a nearly ubiquitously used piece of on-premises email infrastructure, which, as reported by Microsoft, was exploited by a certain particular adversary for some length of time, but then very quickly began to be exploited by countless other adversaries, perhaps nation state, perhaps criminal groups, perhaps criminal groups acting as proxies for nation states. And what this says to us from a national security standpoint is it is very hard at times to delineate in a given exploitation the intention of the adversary, what they are trying to achieve, which means that from a standpoint of prioritization and a standpoint of risk management, we need to move away from presuming what the adversary is trying to target and really focus again on this principle of looking at consequence first and ensuring that those most critical assets are protected under all conditions. And then I think where this leads us to as well is when you look at this issue from a standpoint of impact, of consequentiality, of looking at what our adversaries might be trying to achieve, that can't be a decision made by the IT department alone, right? The IT department, even the security team, is never going to have that business or mission context to do that prioritization. And so one key role, particularly of the legal community in this space, is to work across the IT department, the security department, and the lines of business to help inform that preemptive discussion about prioritization, recognizing both the sophistication and indiscriminate nature of many attacks that we're seeing.
Eric, can I get you to comment on one maybe aspect of your opening remarks, and that relates to the complexity relating to delineating intent. We heard from Mike D'Ambrosia earlier today from the Secret Service, who's been in this business for a very long time. I know you know him well. And obviously your boss when he was deputy previously, and certainly in private practice and now back as the secretary, focused on the intent issue quite directly, and the complexity dealing with attribution, and the issues associated with IOCs, as well as the common refrains that we hear about information sharing, whether it's in the Solarium Commission report or long before. Maybe a little bit more on this intent issue. Mike said earlier in the day, it's really hard to tie something to a state. What's the intent, he said. You're raising that same problem. In the national security context, that's a driver behind labeling something a national security matter. And we know that Allison's going to talk further about that in a few minutes. But maybe just give us a line of sight into some of the both strategic and tactical initiatives or initial thoughts you have in your new role relating to discerning intent. How do we do that better? What are the challenges there so that we can properly engage in the delineation?
Yeah, it's a thoughtful question. I think it bears noting in the first instance that attribution and delineation of intent versus cybersecurity defensive measures and incident response move at very different speeds. And attempts to conjoin those, I think, will result in suboptimal cybersecurity outcomes and potentially derail efforts at effective attribution and definition of intent. I think that where understanding intent and attribution becomes critically important is in two areas. The first is for a victim organization, understanding how to scope an incident response, understanding how to scope a forensic analysis. If we can help understand what the adversary may have been after based upon what we've seen that adversary or ones like it target in the past, that can help an organization understand where to go with their forensics, with their response. Any large organization, the hardest part, as everyone on this panel knows quite well, is where to start, how to scope it, and most importantly, how to say when you're done, how to say we've done enough. And so understanding attribution and intent can help with that aspect. I think also critically importantly, we are not going to solve this problem by cybersecurity alone, right? We are not going to batten down our defenses so that we can say we are now under a hard shell and the adversaries can't get it, right? There needs to be action taken against these nation states and criminal groups that are perpetrating these attacks. This is, of course, the purview of law enforcement and other partners in government. But these attacks can't be cost-free, and in many cases they aren't. And so attribution, even if it takes weeks or months after an attack occurs, still enables a cost imposition to be raised against actors, and ideally over time drives down or increases barriers to entry for these kind of attacks and reduces their prevalence over the long term.
Really helpful thoughts. So thank you for that. Michael Sussmann, over to you. I would particularly highlight, recently, in keeping with what Eric was just indicating, Dmitry Alperovich and Ian Ward wrote an article for Lawfare about the U.S. response to SolarWinds and Microsoft Exchange hacks. Obviously, Dmitry, coming from CrowdStrike as the co-founder, had a different name for SolarWinds. I think he calls it Holiday Bear.
Holiday Bear.
And Michael, I know that you've done a lot of work over the years on national security related matters with Dmitry and others. And we have talked about that article. Dimitri's view is that there needs to be two different types of responses based upon that careful discernment of intent that Eric was identifying, and propose alternative approaches to those responses. With that background, over to you to give a couple of thoughts and remarks in response to Eric's insights about the go forward in the next administration.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to start with a sort of a high level perspective on those issues for the private sector. Then I'll turn to Dmitry and not only the article, but his testimony before the House committee in February and the suggestions he had. National security has been a part of cybersecurity for as long as there's been cybersecurity. And most years, most of the time, there seem to be variations on a theme. There are the same issues about taking care of your fundamentals, insider threat, and the typical arms race that goes on. I feel this year is very different. And I feel like it's different because of the predominance of these third-party app and supply chain attacks like SolarWinds or Holiday Bear and the Microsoft Exchange attack that you mentioned. They are so incredibly hard to manage. And frankly, from the industry side, there's very little to do about it that isn't aspirational. And so for those listening, these are attacks that aren't affecting what you're doing. It's not affecting your firewall or the things that you're doing. You're buying other equipment, oftentimes security equipment, and there are exploits or defects in the code, in that equipment that you then bring on premises. It's very hard to deal with because you're dealing with other people's equipment, and it's and the solutions that are proposed, David, as you raise, are aspirational at best. They're not solving problems for companies in 2021, right? Like the best advice, I'm not gonna say the best advice, but advice I have for companies in 2021 is a little bit like that joke about the two men walking in the forest and they see a bear and one kneels down to tie his shoelaces, and the other says, "You really think you're gonna outrun him?" And the guy kneeling down says, "I don't know about the bear, but I'm sure as hell outrun you." And so we want our clients to be, not the easiest target, so that other people will pursue them. But these are really, really tough, and there aren't any solutions around the corner. For Dimitri's suggestions, his fourth one about increasing security standards for vendors supplying high-risk software is the most practical of them, but that's not a 2021 solution. That's one that's coming on in the future. And I really liked his Lawfare article where he talked about the need for different responses to the Russian SolarWinds attack and the Microsoft Exchange, because the Russian SolarWinds attack, he argues, and I agree, was and I'm careful to use finger quotes, was a responsible attack. The Russians gained access to many, many, many companies and just targeted the few that they were most interested in, cut off access to the other ones. And in that way, it's somewhat typical state actor espionage. He points to examples of the US doing perhaps similar things. The Chinese one, and so he says in that case, the Russians are showing restraint, and we should be careful not to punish them too harshly if we do, because the restraint that they're showing is within the confines of norms that are developing in cyberspace. The Chinese attack, on the other hand, is irresponsible. It opens up attack vectors, tremendous numbers, that isn't just limited to the state sponsors, but to lots of people who can come in afterwards and take advantage of it. And we're seeing that. And so I think he makes a very good case for trying to split up look at the responses through different lenses and apply that. And so I'll just say about this threat, there's just a need for zero trust networks, that companies can't be trusting any apps or any devices that they're putting on their network. And as Eric said, they need to find their crown jewels and layer the best defenses around them.
Let's come back to the issues associated with what we need to do going forward, because I think you've raised a number of good points on that, and I think we should dive deeper into that, Michael. So let's turn over to Allison very quickly. And Allison, I think as Michael just rightfully points out, one of the challenges here is sort of deconflicting and deconflating these types of issues. For many years in the cyber lawyer and the cyber bar and the cyberspace more generally, the language and the definitions have been the same with the privacy folks when we're dealing with confidential or sensitive information, personally identifiable information. And then we saw the development of the GDPR, CCPA, and now Virginia, and obviously enhancements in other states as well. And those were the drivers behind the risk models largely when one would think about how to develop a cybersecurity program. As Michael's pointing out, and as Eric has indicated, and certainly this administration feels very strongly about with Ann's appointment, where you've got national security either overtones or actual national security interests at stake, like we saw in NotPetya prior to that WannaCry, but certainly the NotPetya destructive attacks, and those of us who handled those, that was a wake-up call for many folks in our space, as you know. You've seen all those types of events, Allison, both in government and out. Maybe you could just shed a little bit of light for those of us, over 1,000 folks that have gathered on this call today to join our panel, around how does one engage in that triage activity, both at the beginning of an incident, during an incident, and then later. Because as Eric pointed out, sometimes attribution is latent. It can take time. It's not on the same path as the actual incident itself. Malware, the ones and zeros can move very rapidly. Our response on attribution can be rather slow. And so how is that done? How do those decisions then affect the incident and incident response and the risks attendant to it? And as Michael indicated, clearly business remains on the front line of the conflict, as John Woods likes to say. So over to you.
Great, thanks so much for that, David. Looking at things at that very granular level, a client that has had an incident and is just beginning to triage and start to figure out what's going on, I think it's really important to remember that threat actors have complex motivations, and nation states in particular have different objectives for different operations that they may engage in. they also have increasingly partnered with others. Although many of the TTPs are the same in many ways, what their motivation is can actually be very helpful as you triage and prioritize steps in an investigation. We know that Iran and North Korea engage in ransomware attacks, particularly as pressure on sanctions increases, but there are also many other types of nation state activities and also motivations. If you're a company that's a government contractor or in the defense space, that should always be a consideration that you make, particularly now if you're helping develop COVID vaccines or treatments, if you're engaged in research on highly complex technical issues like quantum computing or drones, things of that sort, things that are going to be on a nation state's wish list in terms of intelligence. That's something to be mindful of and will differ than kind of a large scale privacy breach that would be perhaps more typical of a criminal organization. And in conducting that investigation, as you start to identify the indicators of compromise using both commercially available threat intelligence, perhaps threat intelligence available from the government, cooperating with law enforcement to get additional data, when those indicators of compromise start lining up with a particular threat actor set, that can also inform, okay, what was this threat actor looking for? Why were they here? You also can look to geopolitical events as we prepare to go as a nation back to negotiations with Iran. If you're in critical infrastructure, particularly energy or the financial sector, I would start paying a little bit more attention to those defenses. It's just a pattern that we know that they have. It may be that there's nothing that indicates that, as we saw with SolarWinds and with some of the more recent nation-state attributed attacks. But the access is what's so powerful, and also the use of multiple 0 days. Most criminal organizations are pumping out ransomware and network intrusions like it's a commodity practice. They're going to reuse their infrastructure. They're going to reuse their scripts. Maybe they tweak things just enough not to get caught, but still to take your data and take your money. But if you see 0 days, that should be a real alarm bell that this is someone who is sophisticated and capable and really wants something that you have. And when those things start to line up, it can change the nature of an investigation in a way where maybe you do want a little bit more closer engagement from the government. Maybe more threat intelligence sharing would be very helpful. And that can change the impact on a company. It can change the impact on national security, and certainly would have a broader impact on other companies as well if you just happen to be the first in a larger campaign. Those are just a handful of considerations.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Let me ask you just a more targeted question within that. So if we compare and contrast, what some have commented that, Kevin Mandia, in the context of this recent incident, his bravery with stepping forward to say, we've been hit, and we were a primary target, as were others in this particular event, and we're attributing it in the following manner. TrickBot, where Microsoft stepped forward to do the government's bidding effectively in the private sector in order to protect the 2020 election, went to great lengths to do that. And we saw Cyber Command step in and also take affirmative action for the first time on top of a commercial activity where it was somewhat coordinated, but not fully coordinated, to take action in concert against those C2 systems that you mentioned. And then we saw the Florida water system attack, which got a lot of attention in our space, got some attention abroad, but not a lot of attention abroad, but certainly woke up a lot of folks here in the US to this distinction that you're delineating very carefully and thoughtfully around, Allison, with respect to both intent and attribution, and then impact. That was critical infrastructure, clearly on Eric's list of critical infrastructure in the United States. And does that trigger an active armed conflict and everything that flows therefrom? So maybe just a quick comment on, in your experience, when to begin that analysis in these incidents, so that people are properly applying the necessary algorithm early enough to the fact patterns in order to properly demark which type of event they have. And then we're going to ask, I think, Scott to inform us a little bit about what happens after that if you've got yourself a national security incident.
Yeah, sure. Happy to address that. It's a little bit easier with criminals because usually, it's particularly with ransomware and more recent public shaming and things of that nature, they announce themselves and their motivations are very clear. What can be a moment kind of to pause is when like the investigation doesn't feel right. There's something unusual there. And I think that part of that is because very frequently criminal actors find a prior vulnerability that may have been exploited by a nation state, and they basically upset the party for the nation state who's been very quietly and cautiously collecting data all along. And so when either the motivation isn't clear or the TTPs are very sophisticated, or there may be another actor at play, those are all reasons to think about, should we be expanding kind of the way that we think about this particular incident? It may also be that there is a particular threat actor that is known or suspected of being affiliated with a particular nation state. APT 41, for example, at least in commercially available threat intelligence, it's a little unclear whether they're the spy that occasionally steals, or they're the regular run-of-the-mill cyber criminals that occasionally also spy. So things like that don't fit kind of very classic commodity cyber criminal activities are a reason to kind of open the lens broader and think about things in that context.
Thank you for that. Scott, obviously from your perch within the Department of Justice, and as John indicated at the outset, you've had a unique experience over the years. Now you're in the private sector, looking at it from this side as well. Walk us through sort of your thoughts about, once we've got ourselves a national security related matter, how's the game different? And again, deconflating traditional cybercrime from national security related matters is something you did not only in your role in government, but you're doing it today within delineating between criminal division matters. And as we heard earlier from Mike, Mike said, when we've got a national security nation state matter, we really look to the Bureau for leadership on that as opposed to the Secret Service. Maybe some thoughts just jurisdictionally. How does the playbook change? What are the rules? Clearly the law is different. The incident response playbook is different. Insurance treats it incredibly differently, depending on your fact pattern. Escalation and comms can change. Walk us through that, will you, from your perspective?
Yeah, and it's interesting to be sitting in this seat, figuratively, as before, in a skiff, dutifully poring over intel reports, trying to get attribution.
Right.
And now, in the heat of an incident, attribution almost seems like a luxury. And when you have smoldering servers, you're on the clock for a ransom payment, and you're just trying to figure out how to navigate those issues. And I'm sure everyone on this panel has experienced this, but there is such a press from other constituencies like insurance for companies to come to a quick decision about with whom they're dealing, particularly when it's a ransomware situation. And so having to deal with those two sides of the house when they may not necessarily, the interest may not be consistent in terms of outcome. But yeah, David, to your point, I work criminal cyber investigations and then also national security. And the national security, when something tips over to that side, the resources that are available from the government in terms of investigation and also support of private sector victims, in my experience, are exponentially higher. And it's interesting because the last time you and I were sitting across the table was when I was at the National Security Division, and you were representing an organization that was believed to be the victim of a state-sponsored intrusion. And there was a bit of a dance, and I very much appreciated your collaboration and willingness to sit down with us and allow us to talk to forensic investigators. But there was a line that couldn't be crossed, and we got it. And this conference has had sessions on privilege, And when I was in the government, the crown jewel was trying to get a company's IR report, whether it was Triple Mandium or CrowdStrike or Dell SecureWorks, fill in the blank. And when you're approaching an investigation from a national security perspective, particularly from the government side of the house, there shouldn't be, in your mind, any obstacles. And when you're experiencing the incident as a private sector attorney representing a company, that go-go spirit may not be the same. And so there really is, there's a tension when it crosses the line between criminal and national security. And I'd be interested in David, Allison, Eric, Michael, your perspective. There are some companies, not everyone, that when they learn that an incident may be connected to a state-sponsored actor, sigh of relief may not be the right word, but there is some almost recognition, well, the public perception, how could we, Acme Corporation, stand up to DPRK or Russia or Iran? There's maybe a little more understanding for the incident. But those are some general thoughts on the topic.
No, really helpful. I think we've set this. I think we've set the stage.
Let me make just a comment about attribution. Following up,
yeah, please do.
Cooperation with the government improves every year. It never, it never sort of reaches the end, but it improves every year, and it's critical for attribution. It's critical to talk to typically the FBI, share indicators of compromise, and get better intelligence on who this group is, what they typically do, and it helps us advise our clients on what the motivation is and the degree of diligence that we have to apply to it. And so for indicators of compromise, it's not company data we're giving away. We're always happy to freely share those, and lots of companies get great cooperation information from the government on attribution and sort of who the bad people are and what they're doing. It's just really valuable.
Michael, it's great because I think during the point of discussion earlier in the day on ransomware, a lot of discussion around the OFAC guidance and the issues of coordination with the government around that when it comes to attribution and also checking the list and everything else that, of course, is required. No new law there, just restatement, old wine, new bottle. That's been the rule for a long time. People largely jumped over the old DOJ policy that had been issued, 8 or 9 months before, sort of reminding everyone of that before the OFAC policy, as you are well aware and deeply aware. And then the benefits of that type of coordination and how to do that with Scott in his old job and now in his new job very carefully and critically. We're going to turn the conversation very quickly in our last few minutes. You've all presented sort of the current playing field around the complexities of dealing with national security and its overlay in these types of incidents and how they differ substantially from just typical cybercrime. Eric, I'm going to go back to you. Obviously there's much that has occurred in the last year to prepare with respect to the transition. We've seen the Solarium Commission report. Many, including folks on this panel, participate in the development of that. We're expecting a new executive order out of your administration here in the very near term that, as we understand it and has been publicly reported, will be the most robust executive order on cybersecurity issued to date. We know that we've got Anne and a roster of other very experienced experts in cybersecurity that have been brought into the administration. And we just obviously had the big meetings in Alaska with the Chinese where cybersecurity was front and center. What is the solution going to look like from your perspective to help the private sector, which will clearly remain on the front line of that conflict, navigate these issues, and more importantly, governments? Obviously, we've seen indications from the Biden administration that we're not going to go at this bilaterally. We're looking for a multilateral approach. Are you expecting another GGE greater than 11 participation? Are we thinking that the State Department's going to re-embolden the old Chris Painter office? What are your thoughts about how we're going to engage on national security related cyber matters? And then we're going to go through the panel on some recommendations as well.
Perfect. Thanks for that great question. And obviously it's a broad one, so I'll focus on a few certain aspects of it. I think one area that we are going to see continued focus and emphasis is this point that's been raised throughout today's panel of collaboration between government and the private sector. You mentioned the Solarium Commission, and of course, many of the Commission's recommendations were codified in last year's National Defense Authorization Act. One of the most important recommendations was the codification of a Joint Cyber Planning Office, the JCPO, within CISA. And this organization is a critical step forward in the government's ability to do public, private, and whole of government cyber defense operations and cyber defense campaign planning. And a critical aspect here is, for years, as I think Michael well noted, collaboration between government and the private sector has been getting better, but it's largely been around incidents, around specific events. And we still haven't yet figured out the model for robust collaboration around planning for specific cyber campaigns or types of adversaries or events before those events happen. And so with this new JCPO that's been codified in law, this is going to be the model where CISA will convene partners across the interagency and the private sector to do this essential work and make sure that we understand how to operate and the actions that each government actor and private actors can take in a collective self-defense when these kind of significant campaigns occur. The second piece, and David, you alluded to it, is this focus again on multilateral engagement on a global stage to help drive down the risk from our adversaries. And that includes nation states as well as criminal groups. I think the precise form of that engagement is still evolving, but certainly I think we should all expect the Biden-Harris administration to engage on this issue urgently and engage in a manner that's deeply collaborative, both with the private sector in this country and critically with our allies on a global stage, so that we reestablish expectations for behavior in cyberspace and we enable consequences multilaterally for violators of those baseline expectations.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Eric. Allison, over to you. What's going to move the needle in the national security space around cyber under this administration?
I think a lot of the efforts are going in the right direction. And from the private sector perspective, I think we'd like them to get there faster, with the occasional asterisk on, what liability protection looks like and, is the private sector going to be directly regulated? But that closer support from government is hugely helpful. I cheer every time I see a DOJ press release on indictments of cyber threat actors, because I know that there were so many people behind that did the investigation, the victims that came forward with data and that enabled that. And hopefully what that's doing is turning the heat up in the kitchen enough that some of these cyber threat actors will pull back, and that will make cyberspace a little bit calmer. With the nation state threat actors, that's never going away. And so having better awareness geopolitically of what is going on, better awareness of what valued information, valued access, and also particular motivations from threat actors, I think would help companies better prepare themselves substantially. So excited to hear about the new initiative at CISA, and hope that we'll be hearing more about that soon.
Thank you for that. Scott, what's going to move the needle?
Yeah, and forgive me for sounding a bit like a contrarian, but information sharing isn't going to get us to the promised land. And during the prior administration, there were several novel legal tools that were constructed to address national security risks. There's the ICTF Digital Infrastructure Rule, CMCC, and Expanded Team Telecom. And as we've talked about in today's presentation, the Biden-Harris administration has indicated that they're going to be rolling out some new initiatives, and then it's expected that they'll keep or continue several from the former administration. And just the bottom line is, the greater the threat to national security from compromise of private sector infrastructure, the higher the level of regulation and enforcement there needs to be to try to address and diffuse this situation.
So you're seeing, and you believe that there's going to be an increased prescriptive trend or performance-based trend in regulatory models across the different agencies that have authorities over the various industrial players?
Yes, that's my assessment.
Yeah, that's terrific. Thank you for that insight. And obviously you're not in the minority on that. Mr. Sussman, Why don't you close us out, bat cleanup? What's on the horizon for us? What's going to move the needle?
The thing that I'm most interested in is the thing that I'm going to end up knowing the least about, which is what the new administration is going to do for deterrent, right? Like these big nation state threats are the ones that we're most concerned about in the private sector. And people, discussed earlier, this feeling of helplessness, or what can X company do against Russia, China, North Korea, Iran? Uncle Sam can do a lot. And so different administrations have taken different approaches and different considerations about offensive, defensive, and what equities are at stake. But I think if something's going to change, going to move the needle the most, it's probably that. And God bless the people who are working on it, but unfortunately, it's not something that we're going to know. We're going to know that much about. But that's what I'm most hopeful for.
And what do you think? Just maybe you could further elaborate for a moment, because we've got one more minute on the deterrence game. Is that going to require that the players in that game are the companies? That is, when Henry Kissinger talked about the fact that cyber is much more complicated than dealing with nuclear on the deterrence front, because he said, at least in nuclear, we would measure our megatons, we could measure their megatons, we knew our blast radius, they knew their blast radius, and we knew their blast radius. And so we could play a cooperative game under game theory. In cyber, that doesn't seem to hold, and the players in the game, or at least the victims, as was described in an earlier panel, seem to be the private sector players. So how is that going to work, Mike?
Well, there's different game theory, and in cyber, the game theory is evolving, right? In nuclear game theory, pretty quickly, mutual assured destruction was, people figured that out pretty quickly. It's not the same here. So there are different equities for different countries, economic and otherwise. And I'm not smart enough to figure out what that calculation should be. Certainly, Dimitri had some interesting things to say about it. Different threats for different companies, but being nice and playing by the rules is probably not going to get the U.S. where it needs to be.
Thank you for that closing remark, Eric. We're going to let you wrap us up. Obviously you're in the new spot, and you've got an enormous mandate, and obviously the threats, whether they be cybercrime or national security. There's a lot of issues here that your administration is going to be confronting in the next few years. And you've got over 1,000 folks on the call today that have dedicated their lives and their careers to this space. And we've got students on the line, as well as practitioners that have been doing this for 30 years, like some of us. Give us something inspiring about the path forward, because it can be dark.
I will do my best, David. I appreciate that. I'll just offer a few points. The first is, I think, unlike perhaps the nuclear domain, the cybersecurity problem is not one that the government can solve alone. It really does require collaboration between the government, and not just the U.S. government, but our partners globally, as well as the private sector, critical infrastructure, and companies of all types. And so we are only going to make progress if we are all moving in the same direction, and if we are moving at cross purposes that will just delay our progress in achieving needed gains. The second piece, David, since you mentioned that there are students on this call, I would say that cybersecurity is an extraordinary, evolving, and exciting field. And I think that's shown by the diversity of technologists and attorneys and policymakers who comprise, I'm sure, this audience, among many other disciplines. Would encourage any folks out there to not only consider focusing on this as an avocation, but to consider public service. And I know many on this call had phenomenal careers in the government, and then are now serving our country in a different way in the private sector. Would encourage anybody looking at options, either in the middle of your career or as you're just starting out, to consider public service. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say, please do visit CISA.gov to see opportunities at our agency. As David noted, we are growing fast, and it's a great mission.
Thank you so much. We've had a great panel. Thank you all so much for taking the time today to share your thoughts on this important topic, particularly at this time as we embark on the new administration and the recent issues that have manifested that Michael talked about. So thank you all again.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you to the whole panel. Eric, thanks so much for the government perspective. Scott, Michael, Allison, we really appreciate it. Good time for me to do shout out to the University of Maryland Law School. About a couple dozen students from my alma mater in attendance. The next panel is on financial firms. It's at 4 o'clock, and we'll see you back here in about 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.